The modern idea that civil government should provide public education for all of its citizens was already introduced by the Reformers.
In 410, the Goths sacked Rome, and that was the beginning of the end of the late Roman Empire. So by the end of the 5th century, many of the structures and institutions of the Western Roman Empire fell apart. And we come into this period which many have called the Dark Ages. And there is some truth to that notion, that especially in terms of the institutions and structures, that they had fallen by the wayside. For instance, education, learning to read, was largely preserved within the religious communities and the monasteries, especially the monasteries of England and Ireland. But for the most of society, those basic educational institutions that we saw in the Roman Empire had gone by the wayside. Not until the 9th century, 8th and 9th century, when Charlemagne became the Holy Roman Emperor and created some forms of stability in the West, were these institutions beginning to be resurrected. Charlemagne had a really important hand in trying to bring education into society. Now he was looking for professional, literate people to help govern state. And he turned to the literate people of society, the church, the monks, the bishops, those people who had retained education, and urged them to establish more schools, more monastery schools, schools within cathedrals. By the time you get to Luther, you end up seeing civic lords more engaged in establishing universities and schools. So, for instance, Frederick, the Elector of Saxony, Luther's prince, established the University of Wittenberg right at the beginning of the 16th century. So Luther saw how important education was for communicating his ideas, for communicating the gospel. You could translate the German Bible, but if no one could read it, it wasn't very productive or valuable. He really encouraged public education. We have public education today, but in part the fact that the government saw it as part of its duty to provide for the education of the citizens was passionately argued for by Luther and his colleagues at Wittenberg.
Schools are rare things. Luther wrote a treatise to the councilmen of Germany that they should establish schools, because schools were a way of general education, which he thought was good, just simply for the populace, boys and girls.
Luther believed that we are called to serve our neighbors. He believed that we should be educated and trained into ways that we can serve our neighbors. And so he wanted children to go to school. He encouraged town councils to establish schools. He encouraged parents to send their children to school. He even encouraged them to send their daughters to school, which was revolutionary at the time.
Early on, one of the stated goals of the Reformation is that all people may be taught of God. And one way in which people would be taught of God is that they would have direct access to the Scriptures. Children of farmers, children of artisans, go to school, learn to read. Even the girls should go to read, if for nothing else, that they would be able to read the Catechism and the Scriptures in their own language.
Among the normal populace, you wouldn't expect peasant farmers necessarily to do this. And they're the hardest ones to get to send their children to school because they need the kids on the farm. You know, I mean, we still have longer summer vacations because we still have this notion that kids have to go back and work on the farm. It's still a kind of a holdover. And Luther, if he could get them to come even for several months, considered that sort of a success. He wrote a second treatise on keeping children in school, in which he told the people, you spend money on cattle and on barns and on fences, why don't you spend them on schools and on your children?
All of this, not for the sake of self-fulfillment, but for the reason that they could all then become better servants to the neighbor. The girls could become better mothers and bring up their children better. The boys could fulfill their vocations, whatever they may be, whether they were bakers or butchers or lawyers or diplomats. Education helped them fulfill their vocation better.
Philip Melanchthon was the most important educator in Germany at the time. He eventually was called the preceptor of Germany. And one of the things that he did, in addition to writing textbooks that people would use in schools, was even design statutes and curriculum for other schools that other territories would imitate or model. Johannes Sturm was an adherent of the Reformation, who lived in Strasbourg and followed many of Luther's writings. And the way that he saw that he could further the Reformation in his own time was to establish a school. So Sturm's academy in Strasbourg became one of the most significant and influential schools at that time. He dictated almost every hour of the day on how it would be laid out, the kinds of things a teacher would say from class to class. And so rigorous and well thought out was his school that others would come to watch it and to learn from the model that he gave. One important person was a young French reformer who came to Strasbourg and stayed several months to observe the academy and talk to Sturm and learned about how to further religious education and general education. So impressed was he that he used that model and tweaked it when he went back to Geneva. And this person was John Calvin, who established perhaps the most famous religious academy in Europe at the time. Yeah, the way that Sturm and then others conceived of education was all the way from a grammar school education all the way through gymnasium or what we would say sort of high school education. And in a sense that rigorous division of the hours and the subject matter, those things are carried over into the way in which school, we still see that in school today, third hour math, fourth hour physics. Those kinds of things were principles that the Reformation and many of these famous academies set forth in trying to regulate the entire day with the goal of educating the child.
Education was seen as a public good, not a private good. That is, it was seen as something that would build up the whole society. If you have educated people who are fulfilling their vocations and striving to do better in their vocations, striving to serve their neighbor better in their particular vocations, all of society benefits.